The low, mournful whine echoed through the silent house, a sound so filled with grief it made everyone's heart shatter. Bear, the once proud German Shepherd K9, lay curled beside Shai's empty bed, his nose pressed against the worn police uniform that still held his handler's scent. For 5 days, the loyal dog had refused all food, turning away even his favorite treats, his body growing thinner as his sorrow deepened. "Please, Bear," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking as she knelt beside the grieving dog, a bowl of untouched food between them. "Shai wouldn't want this. You have to eat something." But Bear's dark eyes, once alert and vigilant, now seemed hollow, fixed on something distant, something lost. His powerful frame that had once chased down criminals now trembled with each labored breath. Dr. Winters had already visited twice, concern etched deeply in his weathered face. "I've seen working dogs grieve before," he'd told Rachel yesterday, but Bear's connection to Shai was extraordinary. They had something special. Captain Reeves from the K9 unit had come by as well, bringing Bear's old training toys and even his former kennel mate, Luna, hoping to spark some interest. But Bear had merely acknowledged Luna with the briefest glance before returning to his vigil by Shai's uniform. He was the same after that warehouse explosion 3 years ago, Captain Reeves had recalled softly. Wouldn't leave Shai's hospital room for a moment. The nurses eventually gave up trying to remove him. No one expected what happened next. As Rachel reached to stroke his fur, Bear suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked forward, his entire body tensing. His gaze locked onto the bedroom window, tracking something invisible, something impossible. What happened that night changed everything we thought we knew about the bonds between humans and their loyal companions. The connection that defied explanation. The miracle that no one saw coming. This is the story of an unbreakable bond, of loyalty that transcends death itself, and of a K9 officer who refused to accept that his partner was truly gone. The grief in the Miller household was suffocating. It had been just 5 days since retired police detective Shai Miller had passed away in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after years of dedicated service to the Portland Police Department. At 65, Shai had lived a full life, but for those left behind, especially his wife Rachel and his K9 partner Bear, the world had suddenly become unbearably empty. Bear had been more than just Shai's working partner. For 8 years, they had been inseparable, chasing suspects, finding missing persons, detecting explosives, and saving countless lives. When Shai retired 3 years ago, there was never any question that Bear would retire with him, coming home to live out his days in peace alongside the man who had been his entire world. Their legend in the department was well established. Officer Maria Delgado, who had trained with Shai at the academy, still told rookies about the Riverfront Mall incident, where Bear had detected a hidden explosive device that the bomb squad's equipment had missed. "That dog doesn't just smell danger," she would say. "He senses it somehow." Even Shai's former partner, Detective James Holbrook, who had initially scoffed at Shai's transfer to the K9 unit, calling it a step down, had eventually become Bear's biggest advocate after witnessing the dog's uncanny abilities firsthand during the notorious Westlake kidnapping case. Rachel looked at the framed photo beside Shai's bed, Bear and Shai receiving the department's Medal of Valor, the dog sitting proudly at attention while Shai, never comfortable with recognition, smiled awkwardly at the camera. "He hasn't eaten since Shai passed," Rachel explained to Dr. Winters, the veterinarian who had come to check on Bear at the house. Her eyes were red-rimmed from days of crying, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "I've tried everything. His favorite foods, hand-feeding him, everything." Dr. Winters examined the German Shepherd carefully, noting his lethargy and the way his ribs were beginning to show through his thick coat. "It's not uncommon for working dogs to experience severe grief when they lose their handlers," he said gently, preparing an IV to provide some hydration. The bond between them is unlike anything else. Bear doesn't just miss Shai. He's lost his purpose, his identity. Rachel nodded, wiping away fresh tears. They were connected in a way I could never understand. Sometimes it was like they could read each other's minds. I remember when Bear was just a gangly recruit, Dr. Winters reminisced as he worked. Shai brought him in right after Bear flunked out of 2 other handler partnerships. Everyone said he was too sensitive, too attached. Shai saw something special in him, though. What no one mentioned was the accident that had nearly ended Bear's career before it began. A training exercise gone wrong that had left the young dog traumatized and deemed unsuitable for service. Shai had disagreed vehemently with that assessment, personally petitioning Captain Reeves to give Bear one more chance. "He's not broken," Shai had insisted. "He just needs someone who understands him." Outside the bedroom window, rain began to fall, tapping against the glass in a gentle rhythm. Bear's ears twitched at the sound, but his gaze remained unfocused, his breathing shallow. From the hallway came the hesitant steps of Emma, Rachel, and Shai's 9-year-old granddaughter, who had barely spoken since her grandfather's passing. "Can I sit with him?" she asked softly, clutching the special stuffed dog that Shai had given her, a miniature version of Bear. "We need to get some nutrition into him soon," Dr. Winters warned. "If he doesn't start eating within the next day or 2, we might need to consider hospitalization." The thought of moving Bear from Shai's room seemed cruel, but Rachel knew it might be their only option. As the veterinarian packed up his supplies, she sank into the armchair beside the bed, watching Bear's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. "What do I do, Shai?" she whispered to the empty room. "How do I help him understand you're gone?" Officer Mendez had called earlier, his voice tight with concern. As Shai's former human partner before the K-9 unit, Carlos had known Bear since he was a puppy. "Maybe I should bring over some of the equipment from the training center," he had suggested. "Sometimes familiar work sense can help." Rachel had agreed, though she doubted anything would break through Bear's profound grief. She remembered Shai telling her about service dogs who had died shortly after losing their handlers, as if their very will to live had departed with their human companions. Emma had eventually fallen asleep on the floor next to Bear, her small hand resting on his paw. Rachel covered her with a blanket, noticing how Bear had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, to accommodate the child without actually engaging. That night, as the storm intensified outside, Rachel dozed fitfully in the chair beside Bear. The house creaked and groaned against the wind, the rain now pounding against the windows. Lightning illuminated the old photographs on Shai's dresser, his academy graduation, their wedding day, the 3 of them at Bear's retirement ceremony. Sometime around midnight, she was awakened by a strange sound, not Bear's whimpering, which she had grown sadly accustomed to, but something else. Bear was standing. For the first time in days, the German shepherd was on his feet, his posture alert, his ears pricked forward in the way Rachel recognized from his working days. His eyes were fixed intently on the bedroom window, tracking something with absolute focus. "Bear," Rachel whispered, her heart racing. "What is it, boy?" But Bear didn't respond. He took a step toward the window, then another, his movements stiff but purposeful. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room in harsh white light. In that instant, Rachel could have sworn she saw Bear's tail give the faintest wag. "Is someone out there?" she asked, her voice trembling as she moved to the window. But the yard below was empty, just rain-slicked grass and swaying trees. Bear let out a soft whine, not the mournful sound from before, but something questioning, almost hopeful. His nose pressed against the glass, fogging it with his breath. Rachel watched in amazement as his tail moved again, a little stronger this time. Emma stirred from her sleep, rubbing her eyes as she sat up on the floor. "Grandma? Is Bear okay?" Rachel didn't answer immediately, transfixed by the change in the dog's demeanor. The transformation reminded her of the night Shai had been stabbed during an arrest gone wrong. Bear had been miles away at home, but had suddenly raced to the back door, barking frantically until Rachel let him out. Somehow, impossibly, the dog had found his way to the exact emergency room where Shai was being treated, having traveled across the unfamiliar city without hesitation. Dr. Winters had called it coincidence. Captain Reeves labeled it extraordinary training. But Shai had simply smiled knowingly and said, "Some bonds don't need explanation." Outside, the storm intensified, a flash of lightning illuminating a figure near the old oak tree, there for just an instant, then gone. Bear's tail wagged harder. "What do you see, boy?" she whispered, scanning the darkness outside. There was nothing there, nothing but rain and shadows and the memory of a man who had loved this dog with his whole heart. Then Bear did something that made Rachel's blood run cold. He barked, a short, sharp sound that she recognized instantly. It was his alert bark, the special signal he had been trained to give only to Shai when he had found something important. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Shai?" The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, a question thrown into the darkness of the room. Emma was fully awake now, her small face alight with something between wonder and fear. "Grandpa always said Bear could see things we couldn't," she whispered, moving closer to the dog. "That's why he was the best finder in the whole department." Rachel remembered Shai's stories about Bear's intuition. There was the missing child case in Hawthorne Park, where Bear had ignored the search grid entirely, leading them directly to a storm drain where the frightened 5-year-old had taken shelter. When questioned about his method, Shai had simply shrugged and said, "Bear doesn't follow scent trails. He follows connections." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtle she almost missed it, the bedroom door, which had been firmly closed, cracked open an inch as if caught by a draft. The small wind chime that hung in the hallway, a gift from Shai on their anniversary, began to tinkle softly, though there was no breeze indoors. Bear's reaction was immediate. He turned from the window, his entire body quivering with sudden energy. His eyes fixed on the door, tracking something invisible as it moved across the room. Rachel stood frozen, watching as Bear's gaze followed the unseen presence, his tail now wagging with unmistakable recognition. Then, to her astonishment, Bear walked to his food bowl, untouched for days, and began to eat. Rachel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced with explanations, a draft, coincidence, her grief-stricken imagination, but her heart knew what she had witnessed. Something had changed in that room. Something, or someone, had given Bear permission to live. "Grandpa's here, isn't he?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide. "Bear can see him." There was no fear in her voice, only wonder and a strange certainty. Rachel pulled her granddaughter close, unable to find words. Emma had always been sensitive, noticing things others missed. Shai used to say she had the gift, just like Bear did. Was it possible they were both right? Maria Delgado had once told Rachel about a case in Mexico City where her grandmother lived. A beloved police dog had continued to perform his duties for weeks after his handler died, following invisible commands that no one else could hear. The locals didn't find it strange. They simply said some bonds were strong enough to transcend death itself. By morning, Bear had eaten 2 full meals and had drunk water for the first time in days. The change was so dramatic that when Officer Carlos Mendez, Shai's former partner and best friend, arrived to check on them, he could hardly believe it. "It's like he's a different dog," Carlos remarked, watching as Bear moved around the house with renewed energy. "What happened?" Rachel hesitated, unsure how to explain the inexplicable. I think Shai visited last night," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't mention Emma's drawing, the one the child had quietly created that morning. showing Bear looking at a glowing figure that looked remarkably like Shai standing near the bedroom door, or the mysterious set of muddy boot prints on the porch that matched Shai's size exactly, though no one had gone outside during the storm. To her surprise, Carlos didn't laugh or look concerned for her mental health. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes following Bear as the dog moved to the window again, looking out at the now sunny yard. "You know," Carlos said thoughtfully, "there was this case we worked years ago before Bear. We were tracking a missing child in the mountains, completely lost the trail. Shai insisted on going west, though all evidence pointed east. Said he just knew." He paused, watching Bear's tail wag gently. "We found the kid exactly where Shai led us. When I asked him later how he knew, he just said some connections don't make sense to everyone else." Carlos ran his hand over Bear's back, noticing how the dog's coat seemed to have regained some of its luster overnight. Shai always said Bear wasn't just tracking scents, he was tracking emotional imprints, whatever that means. Rachel remembered the night of Shai's heart attack, how Bear had tried desperately to wake her moments before it happened, how he'd dragged Shai's emergency medication from the bathroom cabinet, a trick no one had ever taught him. "There's a tradition in the K9 unit," Carlos continued, pulling something from his pocket. "When a handler passes, their dog gets to keep something personal. The chief thought Bear might want this." He held out Shai's worn leather badge wallet, the one he'd carried throughout his career. Bear immediately approached, sniffing it carefully before gently taking it in his mouth. That afternoon, as Rachel sat on the back porch watching Bear explore the yard with renewed interest, she felt something shift inside her. Not an end to her grief, but a softening of its sharp edges. Nearby, Emma was speaking softly to Bear, who listened with tilted head as if understanding every word. The elderly neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Henderson, who had always been terrified of the police dog, now watched in fascination from her garden. Bear trotted over to Rachel, dropping a well-worn tennis ball at her feet, his eyes bright with invitation. It was Shai's favorite ball, the one he had used countless times to train Bear, to reward him, to bond with him. Rachel hadn't seen it in days. "Where did you find this?" she asked, picking up the muddy ball. Bear's tail wagged harder, his gaze moving briefly to the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, Shai's favorite spot to sit and watch the sunset. Rachel threw the ball, watching as Bear bounded after it with surprising strength. As he returned, she noticed something else. Around his neck, partially hidden by his fur, was Shai's old whistle on its cord. The same whistle she had placed in Shai's casket at the funeral. Her hands trembled as she examined it, recognizing the distinctive scratch on its side from when Shai had fallen during a pursuit years ago. This was impossible. This was real. "He's still with us, isn't he?" she whispered, running her fingers through Bear's fur. Emma came running over, her eyes bright with excitement. "Bear found Grandpa's special whistle. I knew he would." Rachel stared at her granddaughter. "Did you know about this, Emma?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "Grandpa told me in my dream last night. He said Bear needed his whistle back because they still have work to do sometimes." Before Rachel could respond, Mrs. Henderson called over the fence, her voice trembling with age and emotion. "Your dog's been digging under that oak tree for the past 20 minutes while you were inside. Never seen anything like it. So determined." Rachel walked over to the ancient oak, Bear trotting beside her. There, in freshly disturbed earth, was a small metal box, Shai's keepsake container that he'd buried years ago when they first moved in. Inside was a letter addressed to her in his handwriting, dated just a week before his death. "My dearest Rachel," it began, "if you're reading this, then Bear has found it, which means what I suspected about our connection is true. Death isn't the end of our partnership, just a change in how we communicate." Bear looked up at her, his eyes clear and knowing. Then he turned his head toward the oak tree again, his ears perked forward, listening to something only he could hear. That night, As Rachel prepared for bed, she noticed Bear was no longer sleeping beside Shai's empty bed. Instead, he had moved his blanket to the doorway of their bedroom, positioning himself like a guardian between worlds. As she turned off the light, she heard the soft jingle of his collar as he settled down, no longer consumed by grief, but watchful, protective, at peace. In the days that followed, Bear continued to improve. He ate regularly, exercised in the yard, and even began accompanying Rachel on short walks around the neighborhood. The neighbors who had been concerned about the dog's decline now marveled at his recovery. "It's like he found his purpose again," remarked Mrs. Chen from next door, watching Bear survey the street with alert interest. Rachel nodded, unable to explain that Bear hadn't just found a purpose. He had remembered one. The whistle remained around his neck, though Rachel had never put it there. Sometimes, especially in the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, Bear would suddenly stand at attention, his ears forward, his body alert, as if receiving instructions only he could hear. Dr. Winters was baffled by the transformation. "I've never seen a recovery like this," he admitted during Bear's checkup. "It's as if he's been completely revitalized." What he didn't mention was the strange incident during the examination, how his stethoscope had suddenly moved across the table when no one was near it, or how the room temperature had dropped dramatically when he'd suggested removing Shai's whistle from Bear's neck. Emma spent more time at the house now, often sitting quietly with Bear under the oak tree, sometimes giggling as though sharing a private joke. When questioned, she would simply say, "Grandpa told Bear something funny about when they were police together." 2 weeks after that stormy night, Officer Carlos organized a memorial service for Shai at the police station. All of Shai's former colleagues gathered to share stories and honor his memory. Rachel brought Bear, now healthy and strong again, wearing his old working vest for the occasion. As the police chief spoke about Shai's dedicated service, Bear sat perfectly still beside Rachel, his posture formal and dignified. But when the chief mentioned Shai's uncanny ability to sense danger before anyone else, Bear's ears pricked up and his head turned slightly, as if listening to someone standing just behind them. Rachel felt it then, a subtle shift in the air, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Beside her, Carlos stiffened, his eyes widening slightly as he glanced at the empty space Bear was watching. "You feel it too?" Rachel whispered. Carlos nodded, his voice hushed. "The temperature just dropped about 10 degrees right where he's looking." Officer Maria Delgado approached them after the ceremony, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't want to say anything earlier," she confessed, "but my grandmother would understand this. She always said some spirits stay connected to those they love most." She glanced at Bear, who was watching something move across the room that no one else could see. "In Mexico, we would say Shai's spirit can't fully rest until he knows you're both okay." Young Officer Peterson, the department's newest recruit who had never even met Shai, approached hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said to Rachel, "I don't want to sound crazy, but I keep seeing a reflection in the glass display cases, a man standing right where your dog keeps looking. When I turn around, there's nobody there." As the ceremony ended and people began to mingle, sharing memories of Shai, something extraordinary happened. The station's lights flickered briefly, and in that moment, Bear stood up and walked with purpose toward the memorial table where Shai's badge and photos were displayed. Without hesitation, he placed his paw directly on Shai's official portrait, the exact gesture he had been trained to use when identifying a target. The room fell silent, officers and family members watching in amazement. Bear held the position for a long moment, then relaxed, turning to look at the assembled crowd with calm certainty. "He's acknowledging Shai's presence," Carlos said quietly, his professional skepticism momentarily suspended by what he was witnessing. Rachel knelt beside Bear, wrapping her arms around his strong neck. "I know," she whispered. "He's been telling me all along." That evening, as they returned home from the memorial, Rachel felt a strange sense of completion. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, an understanding that some connections never truly break. She watched as Bear made his usual circuit of the house, checking each room before settling in his new spot at the bedroom doorway. He no longer searched for Shai with desperate longing. Now he moved with the confident assurance of a guardian who knew exactly where his partner was. "You can see him, can't you?" Rachel asked, sitting on the floor beside Bear. "You always could." Emma had insisted on staying the night, setting up her sleeping bag right beside Bear's blanket. "I think Grandpa checks on us at night," she explained matter-of-factly. "Bear always wags his tail around 3 in the morning, even when everyone's asleep." Rachel had received a call from Captain Reeves earlier that day. A local school had reached out to the department, asking if any of the retired K-9s might be suitable for their new therapy program for troubled youth. "I immediately thought of Bear," the captain had said. "If you're comfortable with it, of course. The trainers say sometimes working dogs find new purpose in helping kids." The thought of Bear having a new mission, a new way to channel his extraordinary sensitivity, felt right somehow. Rachel suspected Shai would approve. He had always said Bear had a special way with children, especially those who were hurting. As darkness settled over the house, Rachel noticed the unusual silence from outside. No crickets, no distant traffic sounds, just a peaceful stillness that seemed to wrap around them like a protective blanket. The wind chime in the hallway tinkled softly, though all the windows were closed. Bear's brown eyes met hers, deep and knowing. He leaned forward, pressing his head against her shoulder in the comforting gesture Shai had taught him years ago. In that moment, Rachel understood what Bear had been trying to tell her all along, that love doesn't end, it merely changes form. The whistle around Bear's neck caught the last light of day, gleaming softly. Outside, the branches of the old oak tree swayed gently in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, rustling the leaves in a rhythm almost like whispered words. Some bonds, Rachel realized, were strong enough to bridge even the divide between life and death. And as long as Bear could still hear Shai's whistle, as long as he could still feel his presence, perhaps she could learn to sense it too. Not as a ghost story or a haunting, but as a continuation of the love that had defined their lives together. The next morning brought another surprise. A letter arrived from a family in Westlake. The parents of the little girl Bear and Shai had found during that famous kidnapping case years ago. They had read about Shai's passing in the newspaper and wanted to share that their daughter, now in college, had decided to become a K-9 handler herself, directly inspired by Shai and Bear. "Some connections create ripples we never see," Carlos commented when Rachel called to tell him about the letter. Shai would be proud. Bear's first day at the school therapy program exceeded everyone's expectations. The dog who had once tracked down dangerous criminals and detected explosives now gently rested his head on the lap of a non-verbal child who, to everyone's amazement, began to stroke his fur and eventually whisper stories into his attentive ear. "He seems to know exactly which child needs him most," the program director marveled. "It's almost as if he's being guided." Rachel smiled, noticing how Bear would occasionally glance at empty spaces in the room, his tail wagging slightly as if receiving approval from an unseen observer. The children, interestingly, seemed unbothered by this behavior. One little boy even asked if the nice police officer who sometimes stood near Bear would come back tomorrow. That evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Rachel found Emma sitting with Bear under the oak tree, both of them seeming to listen intently to the brewing storm. Bear stood suddenly, his ears perked forward, his gaze fixed on the bedroom doorway. His tail wagged once, twice, a greeting to something unseen. Then he settled back down, a contented sigh escaping him as he rested his head on his paws. keeping watch over the thin space between worlds where his partner still walked. Rachel smiled through her tears, finally understanding. "Good night, Shai," she whispered to the empty room that didn't feel empty anymore. "We'll see you in the morning." And somewhere, just beyond the veil, Shai Miller smiled back. 6 months later, Rachel sat in the audience at the police department's annual awards ceremony, watching with pride as Bear received a special commendation for his work in the school therapy program. The once skeptical Captain Reeves had become Bear's biggest advocate, telling anyone who would listen about the extraordinary intuition of Shai Miller's retired partner. "He's helped more children open up in 6 months than trained therapists managed in years," the captain declared, placing a special medallion around Bear's neck to join Shai's whistle, which still remained there despite all rational explanation. The department had started a new tradition because of Bear, a moment of silence at each ceremony, where the K-9 officers and their handlers would stand at attention, honoring the invisible bonds that connected them. Some of the more sensitive dogs would occasionally glance at empty spaces beside their handlers, as if acknowledging unseen presences. That night, as a gentle rain tapped against the windows, Rachel watched Bear and Emma sleeping peacefully side by side on the floor. The grief diary that her therapist had suggested she keep now contained more moments of joy than sorrow, more connections than losses. Bear's ears twitched in his sleep, his paws moving slightly, as if running alongside someone in his dreams. Perhaps he was, Rachel thought. Perhaps some partnerships were never truly meant to end. As she turned out the light, she felt the familiar subtle shift in the air, that inexplicable warmth that now brought comfort rather than tears. Outside, the oak tree's leaves rustled in a pattern that sounded almost like Shai's favorite phrase, "Some bonds never break." The bond between a K-9 and their handler is truly unlike any other. Has a pet ever seemed to sense something you couldn't? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that remind us some connections never truly break. Turn on notifications to never miss an upload.